Okay, so before we get into mood disorders, so like depressive disorders and bipolar and related disorders, I thought it was important that we discuss suicide. This is obviously a topic that's very sensitive. It's a topic that I would rather do face to face, but it's important enough that I still think we should do it. And I don't want to bring up, potential suicide as an aspect or a potential result of some disorders without actually kind of going through specifically what this is and what the signs are for it and what you should know about it and what you should do if somebody is suicidal. So first, I would like to take you through some suicide true or false questions, and I want you to kind of think about what you know and what you don't know. So first, people that talk about suicide are not likely to follow through with it. This statement is actually false. Roughly 90% of people who are suicidal or who will complete suicide do talk about their intentions first. What's really important here is that when they do talk about it, and if they do talk about it, it's important that you're not judgmental, that you don't trivialize what they're feeling, that you take it seriously, that you don't keep secrets. And I will explain that later on. The next question, true or false, suicide takes place with little or no warning. And that statement is false. That people with suicide often will talk about it. They might give away their possessions, talk about what they want to have happen when they die, withdraw from family and friends, lose interest in the things that they used to like to do. Now, that said, again, there are times where it happens without a warning, but you want to be able to pick up on the warnings when they are there. And this one, true or false, suicidal people are fully intent upon dying. The answer here is absolutely false. In fact, most people, and I think the estimates are about 3 to 5% actually intend to die. Most are just unsure as to how to go about continuing to live, how to solve their problems, that sort of thing. And standardly, once the suicidal crisis passes, they are generally very grateful to be alive. And I don't know if you've ever seen videos or talked to somebody who survived their suicide attempt. They're usually very, very grateful that they did survive it. That brings up another true or false question that I probably should have put here but didn't, and that is that suicidal people remain so forever. That would be false as well. Suicidal people do not remain so forever. They are usually suicidal for just a short period of time. And this one, true or false, children of parents who attempt suicide are at a greater risk for committing suicide. That would be true. Remember that children can often follow in their parents' footsteps. And this, just because they have a parent who did commit suicide does not mean that they will. But that modeling has been there in their environment, and they've seen this as a potential way to relieve distress when faced with a problem. And so we have to be extra cautious in this case. And here, true or false, men are more likely than women to actually kill themselves by suicide. So the answer to this is true. Men are more likely than women to actually kill themselves by suicide. And what I want you to notice here is that if you can avoid saying committed suicide because it implies criminality, and I know, and I think I may even have it here, in some cases people say completed suicide, but the completed suicide makes it sound like there have been more suicide attempts, and the language really does matter. So you could just say died of suicide or suicide death. They made a suicide attempt. Because the words, it does matter. Just the same, if somebody made a suicide attempt and survived, you want to say just that. It was a suicide attempt, not an unsuccessful attempt, because unsuccessful, like to say something that is successful implies that it might be like a good thing. So unsuccessful, you missed the mark. You don't want to say something like that. It's simply like a suicide attempt. Now, the reason that men are more likely to die than women via suicide is actually not because men make more suicidal attempts. It's actually because of the methods that men use tend to be a bit stronger and less reversible than the methods that women tend to use. Okay, so here, true or false, when a suicidal person has been severely depressed and seems to be snapping out of it, the danger of suicide decreases substantially. This is actually false. It may be that they are at a greater risk when they seem to be snapping out of it, because when people are first coming out of depression, they have actually the energy to make plans and follow through with them. So it would actually be a riskier time. There's a low energy associated with being depressed. So again, snapping out of it implies more energy, which means greater risk. And as I said that language matters, I see I've made a mistake here. So true or false, only depressed people complete suicide. What I should have said is true or false, only depressed people die of suicide. That makes a difference. So the answer here is false. It is high for major depression. It's also high for schizophrenia, sometimes anxiety disorders, alcohol and substance abuse disorders. It could be a result of poor physical health, some serious illness, loneliness, unemployment, natural disasters, bipolar disorder. And obviously depression is part of bipolar disorder, which I will get into. But it is the highest for major depression, and so we want to be careful. And here, true or false, thinking about suicide is rare. That would be false. Thinking about suicide is unfortunately not rare. Not really sure how you get these estimates exactly right, and that's why the range is so big, but approximately 40 to 80% of the general public have thought about it at least once in their lifetime. That doesn't mean that many people have actively planned it, but simply that they have thought about it. And lastly here, asking a depressed person about suicide will push him or her over the edge and cause a suicidal act that would not have otherwise occurred. This is absolutely false. It's a big mistake to not talk about it if you think that somebody is depressed. Because remember, like, society tends to view suicide as a very shameful act. And so talking about it actually gives the person permission to talk about it. Not asking might make the person feel more isolated and more alone, and put them actually at greater risk. You're not putting an idea into somebody's head by asking them about it. You're giving them permission to talk about how they are feeling, and potentially getting them help if they need it. So some common warning signs that you might see with somebody who is in danger of dying by suicide or making a suicide attempt. Well, if they're talking about it, so if they say, that they want to die, or they're going to kill themselves, or they wish they were dead or hadn't been born, these are all potential flags, obviously. Getting the means to take one's own life, something like buying a gun or stockpiling pills, that would be another warning sign. Withdrawing from social contact and wanting to be left alone. Depression is very isolating, and one of the things that you don't ever want to do if you are depressed is withdraw from activity, because activity actually fights the depression. So it's like, all right, you know what, you're depressed, and you don't feel like going to your soccer practice, and you don't feel like going to your dance practice, or there's no point in going to art, or you're not going to hang out with your friends, or whatever. The problem is that keeping those things in your life actually helps to prevent and will help you overcome depression, because people take pleasant and pleasurable things out of their lives when they're depressed, and that fuels the depression. Having extreme mood swings, such as like being emotionally high one day and deeply discouraged the next, would be a warning sign. Being preoccupied with the death, dying, or violence. Feeling trapped or hopeless about a situation. Increasing use of alcohol or drugs. Changing the normal routine, so particularly around things like eating or sleeping. So eating substantially more, or sleeping substantially more, or eating substantially less, or eating substantially less, any type of increase or decrease in those patterns. Doing risky or self-destructive things, such as using drugs or driving recklessly, giving away belongings or getting affairs in order when there's no other logical explanation for doing that, saying goodbye to people as if they will never see them again, and developing personality changes or being severely anxious or agitated, particularly when experiencing some of the other warning signs. Now, I get that you guys are not clinicians. You guys are high school students. You guys are not counselors. You're not therapists. So there's some things like, I don't want you walking around looking to diagnose everybody, but I want you to be aware of some basic things because it could make all the difference in someone's life. It could be life or death. And with that, I want to explain what you do if someone is suicidal. So I would like to share 2 stories with you, and I'm going to start by saying this. Neither person died by suicide. In fact, so far as I know, both of the people that I'm going to be telling you about right now are also alive and well. But I want to make this point, that the story is not about these other people. And so I'm going to try to like the stories themselves are real, but I'm going to try to just mix up the details a little for you because I want you to know that this is a story about how I handled it. It's not about somebody else's struggle with mental illness. And that's an important distinction. You don't get to tell somebody else's story in that way. You get to tell your own. And so with that, I want to give you 2 examples. One case where I handled it poorly and one case where I handled it well. And yet, in both cases, it wasn't easy. It wasn't like, hey, you did the right thing, and then everybody's like happy, whatever. So in one case, there was a girl that I knew who was suicidal, and she was getting counseling help where we were, and she was leaning on a bunch of us a lot, and she was giving away her items to us, sharp objects. She was worried that she was going to hurt herself, and it got to the point that there were 3 of us really that were babysitting her around the clock. We were scared to death that she would hurt herself, and we didn't want to let her out of our sight. Now, right there, obviously, I can flag that because I don't think that it was appropriate for somebody, and I was 17 years old at the time. I don't think it's appropriate for somebody to be in a situation, a kid really, to be in a situation where they're monitoring somebody around the clock because of mental health concerns. But I'm going to put that aside for a second and tell you kind of like the bigger issue as to what happened. We were talking to people where we were, people in charge of the building, the counseling services where we were, we were talking to everybody we could find to try to get this girl help. And she was so bad one night that we were convinced that, if she slipped out of our sight for a second, that we wouldn't have her in our lives anymore. We were convinced. And I went to talk to somebody where I was, and I told them, somebody in charge, and I told them that I was worried that this girl would, take her own life, and the person in charge said that they would deal with it tomorrow. And I said, tomorrow might be too late. You have to deal with this now. And the person told me that they were not going to deal with it now because they had a date and that they would deal with it tomorrow. And I said to the person, if you won't see them now and I can't get help for this girl right now, I am going to call 911 because she's a danger to herself and I'm scared. And she said to me that I would get kicked out of this place so fast if I called 911, that I would be in big trouble. And so I didn't know what to do because I wanted to help this girl, but I also, was afraid of what would happen to me as a result. And so I went with one of my friends, and actually 2 of my friends, and we called my dad. And I told my dad the situation, and he said to me, you know what I'm going to do, right? And I said, I know. He's like, you know this isn't going to go down well for you. And I said, I know. And he's like, all right, you're doing the right thing. I just want you to be sure. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, do me a favor, stay out of sight. I'll make the call. You stay out of sight. Just keep out of it. Don't come nosing around. Just, just keep yourself to yourself tonight. I said, all right. And got off the phone and we waited. And just a short time later, there was fire trucks, police cars, ambulances. Like everybody was at our place to pick up this girl. And we just hid. We were scared. I was more scared that she would die than any of the trouble I was going to get into. And to follow it up, I did get in trouble. I didn't get kicked out, but I got into trouble, and I stood firm because I know that the institution handled it incorrectly. And I know that that was a big problem. The girl is alive and well and happy to be alive and well. And I think I maybe, after that would have learned to have just been more brave and made the call myself. But at the end of the day, what we still saw was we passed it along to somebody else, and that, God forbid, had she taken her own life, that we wouldn't have been like dealing with that on our conscience. Like I want to kind of point that out too, that if somebody decides to take their own life, they have decided to do that. So if this girl had actually died by suicide, would it have been my fault? No, it would not have been my fault. In fact, I was on the other side doing absolutely everything I could to protect her, to help her. But had I done nothing, it still wouldn't have been my fault, but I would have carried that weight around. And who knows the ways in which that would have affected me. And I'm so glad I don't have that story to tell, that I don't have this burden that I'm carrying in that way. And so that kind of brings up the big, most important point here, is that you guys are high school students going into college, in the next, either this year or the following year, and you are not trained professionals. You don't work for suicide hotlines, and you don't work as counselors and therapists, and maybe one day you will, but you don't right now. And so it is better for you to not try to figure out if somebody is serious, if they're seriously going to hurt themselves. What are the chances that it's actually going to happen, or are they just making statements or whatever? You're not actually trained to know that, to be able to ascertain somebody's level of danger, to know whether or not they've provided you an accurate guarantee of safety. You don't know. And so you need to pass it along. It would be appropriate, in this particular case, where you guys are, it would be appropriate to pass it to parents, your parents, the kids' parents, guidance counselors, even a teacher at the school. I mean, if you pass it to me, I work as a teacher, I would have to pass it along to guidance, and I would. But what you would get to do is pass that emotional burden to somebody else who is going to help you take care of it, right? And if something happens and the person does take their life, you know that at least you did what you could. And so to at a minimum, to save you from that mental burden of, of having lost somebody in that way and having to deal with that, better to just pass it along. In worst case, you can do what I did in the scenario, or sort of roundabout did. You can call 911. Because if somebody is a danger to themselves or others, it's appropriate to call 911 and they will respond. But don't leave them alone if they're a danger to themselves or others. So on one hand, I don't want you to be, held hostage by it. I want you to pass it to the appropriate place, but wait until you've passed it. So while somebody is in danger, get somebody else on the scene before you bow out. You do not keep this a secret for somebody. That's not a fair secret for somebody to ask you to keep. It's not okay. The other scenario was really like a friend / dating scenario. And what happened here, and this one I'm going to tell you again, he survived, but I did not handle it well. And I do want to highlight that because I do think I'm lucky that it worked out the way it did, and that was too big of a risk to take. And so let me explain, because there's an important thing for me to highlight for you here as well. That I had a friend, and he was so much fun to hang out with, but I wasn't interested in him romantically, and that's also fair, right? And we'd hang out a lot, and I'd have so much fun, and I just didn't like him that way. And there was, all of a sudden when we'd hang out, he started to like say stuff at the end of the night about, wanting more, and I'd be like, no, 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 that's not what I'm looking for. And then it got to the point where I would try to just cut the night early so that we wouldn't have any talks like that. But really, I should have, he was clear, and I should have, I was clear, but, in my words, but I was still spending a lot of time with him. So I think, there's that. But I started cutting the night early so we wouldn't have these talks anymore because he was so much fun, and I didn't want to lose my friend. And so we went out one night, and I remember we were going out, I don't remember where we were going ultimately, but we started with dinner at Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, and this is pre-cell phones, and I don't know how old I was, 19 maybe, and we were at Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he started early on in the night, and he said, if I didn't go out with him, that he thought he would end his life. And honestly, I didn't know what to do. I sat there at the table, I hadn't taken one bite of food, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't be in this situation, I can't date this person because I'm worried that he's going to kill himself, and that, it absolutely was a hostage-taking tactic, which I recognize now, but then I was scared, I didn't know what to do, and it wasn't for me to decide whether or not he was serious. What I should have done was pass it along to somebody. What I did do was I got up, excused myself to go to the bathroom, and instead of going to the bathroom, I walked straight out the door, a couple miles down to a payphone, and called one of my parents to come and pick me up. And I never, I told my parents what had happened, and so whether or not he ever attempted to call me again, I don't know, because it's very likely that if he did, they just weren't putting the calls through. And I understand that as well. And I don't know, what they did on their end. I never asked them about it. Again, remember, this is my story, not anybody else's. So, but I ran into him. It was 10 years later I ran into him. So he was okay. And thank God, because I didn't, I did something right and something wrong. On one hand, I didn't allow myself to be taken hostage by statements like that, and I'm glad that I didn't. However, I shouldn't have judged that it was all hostage taking and there wasn't any risk to him, because I didn't know. I didn't have any experience or any way to tell. I wasn't his counselor or his therapist. I should have passed it along. And had he killed himself, how would I have felt? So again, I wouldn't have been at fault, but I would have known that I had that information and didn't do what was necessary to protect him, and that would have been my emotional burden for my entire life. So the good, I wasn't held hostage by that. The bad is that I didn't stay there in the moment and pass it along to get him some help. So I beg you, if you're not sure what to do, get to a trained professional, a parent, an adult, call suicide hotline, call 911 if you have to. Don't keep it a secret. Pass it along, Because I don't want anybody to, die by suicide, and I also don't want anybody to bear the weight of having had that information and not done anything about it. And I want you to know that it wouldn't be your fault, but it would feel bad, and I don't want you to be in that situation. So remember, if somebody is or making comments that they are planning on hurting themselves or thinking about hurting themselves in any way, it's appropriate to encourage them to call a hotline, to, encourage them to seek treatment, get support, even to communicate more with you. But be respectful, acknowledge the person's feelings. Don't be judgmental. Don't tell them that like things could be worse. Don't minimize what they're going through. Don't ever keep their secrets about it. It's not a fair secret, and I don't care if you promise that you would keep it a secret. Even in the therapeutic world, like if somebody is a danger to themselves or other, confidentiality is out the window. You don't get confidentiality if you're going to hurt yourself. But obviously, try to get that person to avoid alcohol and drug use. Try to make sure that there's no dangerous items in the person's home or around them. Do give them reassurance that things will get better. Let them know that you're willing to listen, but pass the information along to somebody who knows and can assess how much danger the person is in.